corridor is long and cold, and it remembers. Its stone walls breathe mildew and secrets. There is no music here, only the distant echo of dripping water, and the heavy hush of velvet curtains long since moth-dash eaten. This is where royalty walked, but not as you imagine them, not as the paintings promised, not with grace or poise or God's favor. This is the beginning of a world built on illusion, where power wore perfume and pain hid behind lace, where a king's twisted spine was corrected in brushstrokes, and a queen's failing lungs were silenced with hymns and portraiture. Because royalty, you see, could not be deformed, not in the eyes of the people, not in the tapestries, nor in the legends carved into stone. They were the living reflections of heaven. To admit their flaws was to question the divine order. So, the truth, it was buried, and in its place, a lie told in oil paints and mirrors. Let's begin not with who they were, but with what they were allowed to be. In the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, monarchs ruled not just with armies, but with symbols, portraits, ceremonies, and portraits. Were never reality. They were carefully constructed masks, painted with political purpose. The French sun, king, was shown as a god among mortals, even as his teeth blackened and his legs ulcerated beneath his silks. The Spanish Habsburgs, haunted by centuries of incest, were made to appear solemn, noble, immortal, while their jaws slackened, their minds failed, their bodies rotted young. The palace became a stage, the throne a prop, and behind it all was the body, the real, suffering, broken human body, covered in rouge, bone splints, corsets, silk. This was a world where a prince, born with a withered arm, was tortured daily with iron braces, not for healing, but for appearances. A queen who limped was sewn into metal corsets, her gait choreographed, her pain rebranded as elegance. A czarina whose face bore the scars of disease was photographed only from one side, or not at all, deformity. Even the suggestion of it was treasonous to the myth of monarchy, and so the courts became factories of denial. Artists repainted truth, tailors stitched illusions, doctors swore silence, and servants who saw too much were paid to forget. But forgetfulness is fragile. Time decays everything, even lies now. Centuries later, we open the sealed doors. We read the hidden letters. We study the autopsies. We hold the portraits to the light, and we see the edits. The stories are darker than we were ever told. What happens when a body is forced to lie for a kingdom? What does it cost to wear? A crown while hiding the parts of yourself your world has declared monstrous. This is not a story of royalty as we've come to know it. It is a story of bones, of shame, of rituals done in secret, and of the price paid to look divine when you were born human. Welcome to the painted throne. He was born beneath stained glass, wrapped in silks, embroidered with the emblems of saints, a cradle carved in gold, a name whispered in Latin, Charles, heir to the most powerful dynasty in Europe, a child kissed by divine right, and cursed by the blood that gave it. This is the story of Charles II of Spain, the boy king who would never grow into his crown, because the crown had already grown too heavy with sin. For centuries, the Habsburgs worshipped purity, not of spirit, but of blood. To protect their power, they married cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, building a family tree that folded in on itself like a dying rose. The cost was Charles. He was born in 1661, but some say he never truly lived. His body was a wreckage from the start, a jaw so deformed he couldn't chew, a tongue too large to speak clearly until the age of 4, limbs thin and trembling, and eyes that wandered like a lost child in a fog. Yet his portraits tell a different story. They show a regal young man, broad-shouldered and stoic, with a high chin and the sacred red of Castile draped over his shoulder. But the chin, that famous Habsburg jaw, was the first lie. Behind those images was an empire in denial. The Spanish court became a temple of manipulation. Doctors were forbidden to publish their findings. Artists were instructed to elevate the king's features, and priests, they told the people that Charles was bewitched, cursed by enemies of God, not by the sins of his bloodline. But no hex could explain the king's frailty. At 10, he still struggled to walk. At 15, he could barely read. By 30, his body was failing piece by piece, teeth gone, bones brittle, brain clouded with seizures. And yet they propped him up. In elaborate ceremonies, he was lifted into thrones. His speeches were scripted, then whispered into his ear. His public appearances were brief, choreographed, surrounded by velvet incense and candlelight, as if soft shadows might blur the deformities. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. But in truth, it was genetics, not sorcery, that twisted his bones and slowed his mind. Behind closed doors, the king was a prisoner in his own body. He chewed his food with difficulty, drooled during council meetings, and suffered migraines that left him screaming into embroidered pillows. The court, terrified of scandal, resorted to ritual exorcisms, holy water, chants, burning herbs, as if the devil could be flushed from his blood, the same way one scrubs soot from marble. But nothing changed, because this was not possession. This was legacy. When Charles died at 38, his autopsy, long kept hidden, revealed a body ravaged by inbreeding, a heart the size of a peppercorn, intestines blackened and decayed, a single testicle shriveled, and a brain soaked in fluid. No heirs, no strength, no salvation. His death ended the Spanish Habsburg line, an empire brought down not by war or betrayal, but by the quiet horror of its own perfectionism. And so the mask cracked. The portraits still hang in palaces, silent, regal, noble, but beneath the paint lies a child begging to speak, to walk, to live. Instead, he became a myth, a mirror, reflecting back the danger of blood too proud to bend. Charles II was not bewitched. He was engineered by those who feared impurity more than they feared God. Before the war, before the medals, before the armies obeyed his every word, he was just a boy with a crooked arm, and a mother who couldn't look at him without flinching. They called him Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, heir to the German Empire. Born in 1859 into a world of rigid posture and blood-soaked flags, but he would grow to hate mirrors, because what he saw there was not a future Kaiser, but a broken limb he was taught to view as sin. Wilhelm was born breech, his body twisted during delivery. The result, a withered left arm, shorter than the other, half paralyzed, dangling, like a secret no one wanted to name. Doctors whispered behind doors. Midwives crossed themselves, and his mother, Victoria, daughter of Queen Victoria, could barely hide her disgust. For her, the arm was more than deformity. It was a stain, a failure in the family line, a threat to the imperial image. So she declared war on his body. Wilhelm's childhood became a daily act of cruelty, disguised as medicine. Each morning, His arm was yanked, twisted, forced into steel. Braces designed to reshape him. Ice baths, burning hot towels, electroshock stimulation, all before breakfast. He screamed, but the empire required silence. And so, the little boy learned to wear pain like a uniform. He learned to smile with clenched teeth, to pose for portraits with his withered arm tucked behind his back or concealed beneath heavy capes. A living illusion. He watched his cousins hail, confident, straight-backed, run and climb and fence. He could only clench his one good fist. As he grew older, rage replaced shame. He began to overcompensate, overdress, overspeak, overcommand. His speeches were thunderous, his posture exaggerated. He waved with his right arm so violently, his shoulder would ache for days. Behind closed doors, he kept a collection of whips, uniforms, and war toys. He despised weakness, especially his own. Historians often say he was vain, that he sought war for glory. But beneath the politics and treaties was still that boy, the one who was never held, only corrected. The arm he spent a lifetime hiding became the metaphor that ruled him. He would stretch the empire farther than it could bear, force nations into molds they didn't fit, and snap the world in two, just as they once tried to stretch him into something nature hadn't intended. In 1914, Wilhelm led Germany into World War I. Millions died. And still, he posed in photos with medals glinting, and his left arm obscured. Even in exile, he never appeared publicly without gloves, or the tailored coats that masked his secret. In the end, the empire collapsed. He fled, and no one remembered the boy behind the porcelain shell, but history does. Today, his childhood braces rest in a Berlin museum. Steel, leather, cold, silent, and his portraits still hang in palaces. The good arm outstretched, the bad one vanished, but we know now that hidden limb ruled an empire. That deformity denied, punished, and disguised was not weakness. It was the blueprint for Wilhelm's thirst for control, and the world paid the price. She entered every room like a melody. Soft footsteps, silken skirts brushing against marble, pearls glowing beneath her throat like moonlight. The people adored her, called her graceful, saintly, untouchable. But beneath the tulle, beneath the satin, beneath the carefully practiced tilt of her chin, was metal, iron, heavy, cold, necessary. This is the story of Queen Alexandra of the United Kingdom, the woman who wore a crown on her head and a cage on her body. Born into Danish royalty, Alexandra married Edward, Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne. She became the Princess of Wales in 1863 and later Queen Consort to Edward VII. But long before her coronation, before the portraits and the people's love, she suffered a mysterious illness in her youth, possibly rheumatic fever or a congenital condition. We don't know for certain. What we do know is that it left her with a pronounced limp and a curvature of the spine that worsened with age. But the world never saw it. They weren't allowed to. Alexandra's body became a state secret. Her limp, always hidden behind trained choreography. Her posture, forced upright by iron corsets, painfully tightened beneath her gowns. Her hips and shoulders bound, and realigned by leather straps and forged bone. And still, she smiled, always smiled. She became an icon of elegance, photographed only from certain angles, never captured mid-step. Dresses were custom designed to hide her asymmetry, with long, sweeping trains and corseted bodices. Fashion editors called her a trendsetter. But she wasn't setting trends, She was building armor. For decades, she played her role perfectly, even as the iron corsets dug into her ribs, even as the pressure on her joints became unbearable, even as her hearing began to fail. Another secret the palace never acknowledged: she would walk with a cane in private, then abandon it for royal ceremonies. At balls, she danced only briefly. The rest was performance, a calculated illusion of vitality. And when her children died, 3 of them, one after the other, she wore black lace for the rest of her life. Grief became her wardrobe. Pain became her ritual. Doctors offered surgical options. She refused. She knew the truth. If the people saw weakness in her, they might see it in the empire. So she endured, privately, proudly. Tragically, her iron corsets were never displayed in museums. They remained hidden, like the limp, like the hearing loss, like the grief. Even her autopsy was sealed. What they feared most was not death, but disorder, imperfection. A monarch's body was meant to symbolize the state itself, unbending, stable, serene. And so, Alexandra became a living monument to repression. When she died in 1925, crowds lined the streets for her funeral. They whispered of her grace, her beauty, her regal stillness. But she was never still. She trembled, she strained, she endured, because the corset never came off. Not really. Even now, her statues stand tall and perfect. But look closer behind. The marble veil, and you can almost see the steel beneath the lac. Alexandra's elegance was real, but it was bought with suffering. A suffering she bore so no one else had to see it. And in that silence, she became more than a queen. She became a ghost of what women were forced to become when pain was not allowed to exist. He called himself the Sun King, Louis XIV of France. A monarch so radiant, he claimed the universe itself revolved around his presence. He built Versailles, a palace of mirrors, marble, an impossible light. He was a god in gold, until you stepped too close. Then you could smell it. Behind the powdered wigs and embroidered brocade, behind the marble statues and orchestras, was a body rotting in real time. From his youth, Louis XIV was plagued with illness, boils, abscesses, fevers that returned like old ghosts. He lost most of his teeth before he turned 30. He suffered from painful anal fistulas, an affliction so taboo it was never spoken aloud in public, yet it defined much of his adult life. His legs often trembled, his breath reeked of rot, his skin was stained from countless cures. But none of this reached the paintings. None of this disturbed the myth. In public, he was immortal. Every step of his day, from rising in the morning to dressing, eating, and even sleeping, was ritualized, performed before courtiers, as if he were a living god. But what they didn't see were the private rituals, the bleeding, the mercury, salves, the poultices of pigeon dung, applied directly to his open sores. He endured more than 2,000 medical procedures in his lifetime, most of them agonizing, many of them dangerous. His doctors were praised as saviors, but they were also butchers in velvet robes. And then came the fistula, a small wound near his tailbone. It grew, infected, festered. He could not sit. He could not ride. He could barely walk. The court panicked. What is a king who cannot stand? They brought in Charles Francois Felix, a surgeon who had never performed the procedure before. He practiced on peasants, some of whom died before touching the royal flesh. The surgery was done without anesthesia. Using a scalpel heated in flame, A wound opened near the base of the spine. Louis screamed, but did not cry. Afterward, the court declared it a miracle. Poems were written, paintings were commissioned, plays performed, not about the suffering, but about the divine resilience of the king. The wound reopened several times. No one spoke of it again. By the end of his life, his body was a map of decay, ulcers, inflamed joints, a perpetual stench that perfumes could not mask. Yet Versailles continued to shine, its fountains flowing, its chandeliers blazing, its court dancing in denial. Louis himself embraced the illusion. He dressed in gold until the very end. He stood tall even when his spine curved. And when he died at age 76, after reigning for 72 years, they painted his corpse to make him appear serene. They stuffed his nose with herbs, powdered his face, closed his eyes. A king, even in death, must not appear to suffer. But he did suffer, deeply, privately, for decades. And it is that suffering, masked in splendor, that became the true legacy of Versailles. The Sun King burned bright, but the light blinded those closest to him, even as his body withered in shadow. He proved that kings are not gods, but men. Men who bleed, stink, decay, even when draped in gold, and the throne he left behind. It glittered still, but it smelled of smoke and blood. They called her Sissi, Empress of Austria, Queen of Hungary, the most beautiful woman in Europe. But beauty, in her world, was never gentle. It was a weapon, a mask, a cage. This is the story of Elizabeth of Austria, a woman, worshipped for her face, and destroyed by the mirror from her teenage years. Sissi was cast into a world she never asked for. At just 16, she married Emperor Franz Joseph. She was shy, poetic, and wild-hearted, but now she belonged to the cold marble of the Habsburg court, and their beauty was law. The portraits had to gleam, the waist had to shrink, the age must never show, so she declared war on her body, a war no one else was allowed to see. Each morning she fasted. She dined on raw meat juice, oranges, or nothing at all. Her waist measured 19 inches, kept that way with whalebone corsets so tight. They left bruises and broke ribs. Her hair, long enough to reach her ankles, was washed with raw egg and brandy, a ritual that lasted 3 hours each day. During it, no one was allowed to speak. Even servants were required to move in silence, so as not to disturb her concentration. She recorded her weight obsessively, refused to be photographed past her 30s, commissioned statues that showed her eternally young, never aging, never flawed. 2. Grow old, she said, was a form of death. But behind closed doors, she was already mourning. She suffered from eating disorders, severe depression, obsessive rituals, and isolation. She wandered palace corridors alone, traveled compulsively from the Alps to the Mediterranean, always running, as if trying to outrun her reflection. She slept with scarves soaked in vinegar, believing they would preserve her skin. She had her own fitness room built in the palace, unheard of at the time, where she performed punishing exercises daily, sometimes until she collapsed. They called it discipline, but it was punishment. Sissi also bore tattoos, a secret kept from the court. One of an anchor just above her heart. She said it symbolized her desire to drown. She was fascinated with death, wrote poetry about oblivion, visited cemeteries in disguise. She once whispered to her confidant, "I want to vanish like the setting sun." Her son, Crown Prince Rudolph, committed suicide in a murder-suicide pact at the age of 30. It shattered her. She wore only black from that day on, and a veil, a scarlet one. Not because she bled, but because she wouldn't let anyone see if she did. Even as she aged into her 60s, the Empress refused to be seen. She walked in shadow, traveled in secret, spoke little, smiled even less. She became a ghost of her former self, not just emotionally, but physically. A living statue erased by her own expectations. In 1898, while visiting Geneva, an Italian anarchist approached her. He stabbed her with a sharpened file, a weapon she didn't even feel at first. She collapsed minutes later, her corset holding the blood in place until it was too late. She died as she lived, quietly suffering, beautifully composed. The scarlet veil she once wore became today. She is remembered as a fashion icon, a tragic beauty, a melancholic queen. But what they rarely say is this: her beauty was her burden, her rituals were her chains, and the empire she ruled was never hers. To begin with, it belonged to the illusion, to the mirror, to the veil in the heart of the Joseon dynasty, where scholars worshipped Confucian order and kings ruled as the earthly echoes of heaven. There was a secret not written in royal records, a secret not spoken in the annals of history, a secret buried in silence, wrapped in silk, and drowned before it could breathe. This is the story of the hidden twin, the child erased so that a throne could remain pure. King Yongjo, one of Korea's longest reigning monarchs, was born in 1694, the son of King Sukjong and royal noble consort Suk. He was wise, cunning, and politically sharp, but from the very start, his birth was a complication. According to unofficial palace rumors, he was not born alone. He had a twin, but in the rigid Confucian structure of Joseon Korea, twins were considered a curse, a spiritual imbalance, an omen of disorder. Two lives born at the same time. It broke the celestial order of inheritance, and worse, a younger twin ascending before the elder would be unthinkable. A violation not only of family hierarchy, but of the divine mandate itself. So the solution was silence, and Blood, the twin. Some say a girl. Others whisper a sickly boy was taken from the birth chamber before the ink dried on the records. No name, no burial, no shrine. In the royal court, rituals were everything. But this was a ritual of erasure. Midwives were paid, records burned, servants reassigned to remote provinces. And when Yongjo was announced to the court, he was introduced as a singular gift from heaven. The people celebrated, but the palace remained haunted. Throughout his reign, Yongjo was known for his obsession with order. He restructured the Confucian civil code, imposed strict punishments for even minor disobedience, revised ancestral rites down to the breath. Historians call it discipline, but behind it may have been a hidden fear that his throne stood atop a lie, a vanished sibling, a life taken so that his might rise. There are whispers of a hidden chamber in Changdeokjung Palace, sealed to all but a few, of nightly offerings left beneath moonlight, not to ancestors, but to someone unnamed. One tale tells of a royal nurse who was driven mad by guilt. She would weep in the corridors, murmuring, "They drowned the moon. They drowned the moon." Another claims that in his later years, Yongjo suffered vivid hallucinations, visions of a child in shadow, reaching toward him with small, wet hands. None of this was written in the veritable records, the official court documents of Joseon kings. But perhaps the omission itself is the loudest confession of all. In a culture where birth order was sacred, where ritual dictated the soul's place in the universe, a twin was more than an inconvenience. It was a rift, a glitch in heaven's design, a threat so great only obliteration could resolve it. And so King Youngjo ruled, brilliant, respected, feared, but beneath the embroidered robes, beneath the scrolls of law and virtue, lived a second heartbeat, one that never left. His legacy is taught in classrooms. His portrait hangs in museums. But his reflection, if you look long enough, seems to blink twice. There were not 7 kings in this story. There were 8. One never crowned. One never mourned. One never meant to be seen. She was born into snowfall and silence. Grand Duchess Tatiana Nikolaevna, second daughter of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, a Romanov princess, a symbol of virtue and grace in a crumbling empire. She was called the tallest, the most regal, the ice blossom of the north, but what the world saw was never the whole picture, because in the heart of the Russian court, appearances were law, and scars were treason. It began in childhood, a fire. Some say it was a candle toppled in the nursery. Others blame a faulty stove in the winter palace. The details were erased. What remains is rumor. Tatiana suffered severe burns across her back and shoulder. It was not fatal, but it was visible. Red, ridged skin, tightness that made her wince, clothing that chafed, a royal body marked dot, and in the Romanov dynasty, imperfection was unacceptable. Immediately, the machinery of erasure began. Doctors were summoned in secret. German specialists brought in under the guise of spiritual wellness. The Empress Alexandra, already fragile with anxiety and obsession over royal purity, insisted that no one beyond the family was to know. Photographs of Tatiana were heavily controlled. She posed only from the front or side, draped in veils, high collars, and carefully arranged sashes. Court painters blurred her silhouette, darkening the background to blend the scars into the shadows of her dresses. To the Russian public, she remained untouched, perfect, royal dot. But behind palace doors, the truth lingered. Tatiana developed a fear of mirrors. She would flinch during fittings, avoid bathing around her sisters. Servants reported moments where she stood motionless for hours, staring at her hands as if trying to feel something deeper. She once whispered to her maid, "If the church sees me, they'll say I was kissed by hell." Her scar became a private ritual. Each night, salves were applied, bandages changed, prayers said, not for healing, but for invisibility. As she grew into a woman, marriage proposals came. Princes from Sweden, Bavaria, England, but every match was declined. Publicly, they said, she was too devoted to the church, too close to her mother, too sheltered. But those within the court knew the fear that her scar, once seen, would unravel the myth of Romanov perfection. She was the burned bride, not because she married, but because no one could be allowed to marry her. And yet, Tatiana was not weak. She served as a wartime nurse, tended to the wounded during World War I, bandaged the limbs of dying men with the same hands that covered her own pain. In the end, it wasn't her scar that ended her story. It was the revolution. In 1918, Tatiana and her family were imprisoned in a basement in Ukraine. They were executed by gunfire and bayonet under cover of darkness. When her body was exhumed years later, forensic evidence confirmed the stories. Burn scarring along her shoulder blade and spine. History had tried to hide it, but the truth, burned into flesh, remains. Today, tourists walk through the Winter Palace. They see portraits of Tatiana, stoic, cold, flawless. But look closer. Look past the symmetry, the posture, the pearls, and ask, what did they fear so much that they would erase it from the face of a daughter? She was not broken. She was wounded. But even wounds, when denied, become ghosts. And the burned bride of Russia still lingers in lace, behind. Glass, behind lies. In every palace, there is a room that echoes louder than the rest. It may be a gallery of portraits, a chamber of mirrors, a throne hall where silence weighs heavier than gold. But listen closely, and you'll hear the echo of 1,000 voices never allowed to speak. This is the end of our journey, but not the end of the lie. This is the story of the marble lie, the final mask that still stands. Royalty is carved in stone. Their statues gleam, untouched by time. Their portraits, locked behind glass, remain forever young. You've seen them. Tall, regal, balanced. Eyes forward, spines straight, limbs symmetrical. But none of it was real. The 7 royals you've met, Charles the Bewitched, Wilhelm the Porcelain Prince, Alexandra in her iron cage, Louis XIV rotting in velvet, Elizabeth beneath her veil, Yongzhou haunted by a missing twin, Tatiana bearing her burn like a crown. They were not exceptions. They were the rule, because the royal body was never human. It was symbol, and symbols must be perfect. Scoliosis was sculpted into statues as grace. Madness was rewritten as piety. Scars were blurred with shadow. Pain was censored. Even the dead were corrected. Bones repositioned in coffins, death masks. Softened, autopsy sealed away with royal wax. The myth had to be protected, because if a king could limp, if a queen could weep, if a prince could be born broken, then what did that say about the divine right to rule? What did that say about the world they built? The truth is simple. These were people, children forced to become mirrors. Women taught that pain must be graceful. Men taught to turn their deformities into empires. Their bodies became blueprints for repression, their suffering institutionalized, their humanity erased. And we, centuries later, still walk their corridors, still visit their palaces, still photograph their marble likenesses without ever asking, who were they when the portraits came down?